Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of today's Stock Opening Bell. First of all, I hope that you all had a lovely Easter and you are now excited to get back at the Bucharest Stock Exchange, especially now that we're approaching the start of the first quarter results here at Bucharest. For today, we're going in London, where we will be discussing with Dorian Carrell, the co-head of multi-asset income at Schroders. Dorian will share with us his perspectives of the market, his feelings, and of course we will be touching the most anticipated subject here in Romania, the IPO of Hydroelectrica. Dorian, hi, good morning. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Good morning.
And, thank you very much, Dorian, for being here with us. How are you? How's the weather in London nowadays?
It's good. It's finally sunny. I took a little break with my family just now, so I'm back today. And but we haven't had a spring yet, so hopefully we'll see more of a spring in markets as well.
Spring in the markets. That's very interesting. Thank you very much, Dorian, for this interview. Let's see about the markets. What is your feeling right now? How do you see the markets, the equity and the bonds markets in Eastern Europe and in Europe in general?
Yeah, I mean, it probably helps to take a bit of a global perspective to start with, just to draw things in. But we're clearly at a bit of a crossroads. So we're looking forward to the Fed meeting in a few weeks' time. And probably for the first time, we are looking towards the peak in US rates. And so we think that the Fed will raise rates by 25 basis points and then pause for an extended period of time. And this really sets the scene for global markets. So generally speaking, we find the US market, the equity market, expensive, but it has done well. So if we look at NASDAQ year to date, clearly it's been pretty powerful, pretty strong. And we think that may change as we go into the second half of the year. But if we look further afield, we look at Europe, European equity valuations are attractive. Again, the market has done well, but we think the upside is quite considerable still from here. So we think there are opportunities in Europe, and particularly as US dollar investors start to look at opportunities outside their own market. So they see the euro appreciating, for example, that makes it attractive. Looking at Eastern Europe within that context, I think definitely over the last 18 months, what's happened in Ukraine has had a great effect on market psychology towards Eastern Europe. So I run an emerging market fund, and I mean, the most obvious thing is that Russia has disappeared from the universe. So in a sense, for Eastern Europe, that is a source of demand because there's less money to go to Russia. It means that it can go elsewhere. But definitely sentiment has suffered, and there are a lot of banks, there are a lot of energy stocks in Romania, in Eastern Europe. And so you definitely need positive market sentiment. And we think that with Europe potentially doing quite well, that could help lift Eastern Europe and include Romania there as well.
And the bond markets, because last year we here in Romania, what we had in the private pension fund, the first year with losses was because of the bond market. How do you see the bond market nowadays? Is it calming?
Well, again, I mean, I think the backdrop is so important because the dollar, should it be peaking, should rates be peaking in the States, that's very helpful for bond markets around the world. And emerging markets generally have hiked rates in anticipation of the Fed this cycle. And so we do see opportunities in emerging market local bonds. The most obvious ones are not in Europe, they're in Latin America. And that's because you have yields of 10 to 12% and potentially currency appreciation as well. When we look at Romania, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is in the region of 7% in terms of yields, with the dollar market around 6%. So clearly, if the currency is stable, that's attractive. We're looking at a investment grade credit here. It's often been a favorite of our credit teams to dip into Romanian bonds when they're positive on the markets, because it's one of the best, most attractively valued high quality credits that we see. So clearly in a stable environment, there's opportunity there.
How do you see the economic context now that the inflation seems to cool off? What we had last week from the what we had on the Wall Street and also in Romania and inflation going down, how do you see the stock market, given the fact that you said that the peak is here at Fed meetings?
Yeah, well, it's a very opportune time to speak to you today because we had PPI just a couple of hours ago. And there, I think there's evidence in CPI in the shelter data that that's starting to come down. So housing in the US is finally beginning to fall. That was very, very important for Powell. Within PPI, it was the headline that came down most. So that's energy related. So you can kind of ignore that. But the core rate did come down a little bit too. And that feeds into the PCE, the favorite indicator of Powell. Putting it all together, that should, with the exception of the banking crisis that we've seen, that would create a much better backdrop. But because there's nerves around the banking market, people are worried about recession.
Is it there a recession coming?
That's a direct question, isn't it? I think I'll give my personal view. I think the US will just about skirt a recession, just about avoid a recession, or have a recession that's fairly shallow and the market can look through it. Because the tremors in the banking market, which are very much contained in the smaller bank segment of the market so far, have helped push the idea that rate hikes will carry on for a long time away. So we can now look to the interest rate market and see more stabilization. That's very important because it's the volatility of interest rates that's been much, much higher than the volatility of equity markets or currency markets in the last few weeks. So it's the volatility, the uncertainty around the path of interest rates that is making people so concerned about the economy. If that starts to fade, that's a big positive, potentially.
Dorian, one of the first things that it's on the agenda when we're talking about inflations, it's the energy prices and therefore the bills. How do you see the energy sector? Because, for instance, in Romania, at Petrom had last year 2 billion euros in its net profit. So that's a price to earnings ratio of around 3. How do you see the energy sector nowadays? Are the evaluations fair enough, or do you see room for going even higher?
I think there are two ways to answer this question. The first is at the oil price level, because that's what people have been worried about. The oil price has been falling and people are concerned, and that might indicate a recession. So there's a bit of circularity in the way people think about it. OPEC has stepped in and they have reduced supply. And the aim of OPEC is to try and get the WTI, the international oil benchmark, to around $90. To a lot of people, that seems a worry in terms of inflation, and it seems a concern. But if you think about the oil price and you adjust it for the last 2 or 3 years of inflation, it's incredibly cheap at the moment. So going to your point, if the Romanian company you mentioned is trading at 3 times earnings on this oil price, which is anyway low, if UK oil companies and European oil companies have huge dividend yields and are trading at very high free cash flow, and then if we go to the US and we look at the E&P sector, again, it's very attractive. And what's interesting for us is you're beginning to see consolidation in the US. So you saw a bid for a company called Pioneer in the last few days. And that recognizes the fact that the oil and gas plays are cheap. So I think the value opportunity was always there. We were looking for a catalyst. The catalyst may well be companies starting to buy and consolidate. And we would expect Europe to follow and Romania to follow. The one exception there, I would say, is that elsewhere in Europe, and I can't comment on Romania, windfall taxes have caused a bit of turbulence in terms of predictability of earnings.
Even last week in Romania, this law with this tax was resent by the president to the parliament for a re-examination. Dorian, what about the banking sector evaluation? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say personally, I got this a bit wrong because I've been positive about banks through the year, but there are three areas that are interesting. The first one is Europe, and here it's a very simple idea. Before we had the Credit Suisse issue and the forced marriage, if you like, with UBS, we had a very attractive valuations. And now when we step back, we're still trading at about 0.6 times book value. So they're trading below their book value. And you can probably calculate about a 25% yield going back to shareholders in the next 3 years in European banks. So if we assume that Credit Suisse was idiosyncratic, and I think a lot of people were anticipating some kind of issue at Credit Suisse, there could well be an opportunity in Europe. The other ones that are interesting are two other areas, are US. And here, I mean, small cap banks definitely have issues about confidence and deposit flight. And so there is a question about how much liquidity they should hold as a barrier to that. And also how the Fed can regulate to help confidence in that sector. And that has implications for commercial real estate. But if you look at the large cap banks in the States, they're incredibly attractive valued and they don't have the same issues. In fact, they stand to gain because the money going into money market funds is run by the large US banks. And the loan to deposit ratio in the States is only 70%. It's very low. But the fascinating one, and the one that we're looking at on a 6-month view, is Japan. And here we have a country that hasn't been able to raise rates consistently for 30 years. So everything you see in Europe could be magnified in terms of opportunity in Japan.
And on this subject, Dorian, do you think that over the past years, the central banks, they moved way too fast or slower with the increasing of the interest rates?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, I think I'm going to swerve your question a little bit by breaking it into parts. Initially, they moved too slow, which forced them to accelerate. I don't think they had much choice in terms of the acceleration. And I think in Europe, there's still rate rises to come. And obviously in Japan, nothing has even started yet. They're still talking about yield curve control. So in terms of speed, it's more important perhaps where they are today. And in the US, in real terms, rates are just about a little bit tight. So if you adjust for inflation, but the assumption is with inflation coming down, they will become tighter. In Europe, on the other hand, real rates, inflation adjusted rates are still negative. And Japan, they're still negative. So we think that's something that people need to watch. You know, it's not that rates are tight in inflation adjusted times.
Something that people need to watch. Let's remember that, because I will come back to it. But before that, do you think that an episode like Credit Suisse, is it possible to happen again in Europe in the next, let's say, 3 years? Like a big bank being rescued by a bigger bank?
I mean, of course, it's possible. You absolutely cannot rule out the possibility that will happen. The issues there, though, were very much they didn't happen overnight, and there was quite a lot of anticipation. What was not expected was the speed of the denouement, if you like, the kind of how fast everything happened and how they had to marry over the weekend. I think it's unlikely that we'll see something very identical, but there could be problems in the banking sector, of course. I mean, rates are tightening, that will lead to stresses in some places. Our best guess is that something on the scale of that is unlikely, but among smaller banks, both in Europe and the US, you'll continue to see some issues.
Dorian, I have 3 more questions. The first one, as you mentioned, the indicators, the announcements that investors should pay attention to. Can you give us 3 examples, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, so we've had the inflation readings on the consumer side, the producer side, so both of those are important. We will have the PCE, which is the Fed's preferred gauge of inflation, and that's coming up ahead of the Fed meeting. I think what's interesting now is that the Fed staff, the people preparing the reports, the economic reports, are predicting a recession, shallow recession. Yet the Fed itself is a bit more sanguine, is a bit more calm about that. So it'll be interesting to see what Chairman Powell says in the press conference afterwards. Because if there is a hike of 25 basis points, the key question is not the hike, it's whether he prepares the ground to stay where things are. But the most important indicator of all for us is actually the anticipated interest rates in the States. So right now you have 25 expected, that's consensus, but you have a number of cuts expected by Q1 next year. While in Europe, you have no cuts expected. And it's that disconnect between the two that we think investors should watch. Because to us, it makes very little sense if inflation, if we are structurally in a world of higher inflation, which we think we are, that the Fed will be cutting rates aggressively in the next 6 to 9 months. And that is helping drive tech company valuations at the moment, even today.
How do you see, how does Schroders see Romania?
As I said to you, I mean, the Eastern European landscape has changed quite considerably, and we now consider Eastern Europe and the Middle East very much separately. So within that, we look at Romania, we look at Poland, Czech and Hungary as more important components of a smaller universe. To be really honest with you, I think the lazy way that some people see Eastern Europe as an extension of Europe, but we think that the drivers in terms of growth are more attractive. And should the inflation level in Romania start to come down, that's really what we're looking for, because at the moment it's pretty high. And it's not just a problem, it's a problem in Poland as well, for example. So if inflation starts to come down in Europe, we think that's attractive for local debt, attractive for the currency, but we think that's probably the real catalyst for the equity market, which is trading, you know, in single digits, mid-single digits. It looks amazingly attractive. We're waiting for a catalyst. We're trying to find something that looks like a sustainable catalyst.
A catalyst could also be an IPO, perhaps?
Yes, yeah, there's one that's been talked about for some time, I believe.
One of the biggest IPOs in Eastern Europe, and I'm very keen to hear your opinion regarding the IPO of Hydroelectrica on the Bucharest Stock Exchange. How do you see things at this IPO? It's valued around 2 billion euros. How's the take from London?
Well, I think it would be good to see. I mean, you know, there's been such a slowdown in listing activity and IPOs. Clearly in London, it's a separate issue, but generally this year, because confidence hasn't been good. Especially when you look at the segments that the company is operating in, it's new energy, it's hydroelectric, and there looks to be diversification now into wind, into solar, etc. So from a Schroders perspective, I think, again, that would be a catalyst in itself, because it would raise the profile, both of the Romanian stock market, but also of this particular segment and ESG type investments within Romania, within Eastern Europe. And that would be a real diversifier for us in our emerging market strategy, for example. So there should be a lot of demand, but I think this discussion's been going on for some time in terms of the listing. And there was discussion, I believe, on a dual listing, which has now been abandoned, as far as I know. And so the question is liquidity. You know, how much liquidity will you get through the listing, and are there concrete plans? When will it happen?
Dorian, the last question for you: if you are to identify 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages for the Eastern Europe, what would they be? First of all, that we need a catalyst. What would the other advantages and disadvantages be?
Well, I think the advantages in Eastern Europe are clear. I mean, it's the growth profile from a longer term perspective is much more attractive. If you look at Europe, you look at Japan, you look at the US, increasingly looking at the US, what you're seeing is that policies are driving productivity down and growth down. So Eastern Europe and Romania can clearly take advantage of that. The second thing I would say for Eastern Europe, as the geopolitical situation changes, there must be opportunities in terms of supply chains relocating to Eastern Europe. You see it before in terms of Slovakia and the car industry, but if you look at different supply chains for Europe, which tend to be sort of on their borders, there must be a major opportunity there, one would say. And finally, I mean, it's just valuations. The valuations are much lower than people outside Romania realize. And I know that may sound odd to you, but when people are preoccupied with geopolitics, with energy crises and so on, they tend not to look at the opportunities that aren't directly in front of them. So I would say it's a kind of, the disadvantage is that people have to feel better about the world and about growth, but the advantage is the upside is much greater.
Thank you very much, Dorian. From London, we had Dorian Carrell, the co-head of multi-asset income Schroders. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much.
I will now switch in Romanian, Dorian, with your permission, for the closing remarks. Vă mulțumim tare mult că ne-ați urmărit. Până data viitoare, tir întins la investiții câștigătoare. Numai bine!
Știu ce spun.
Un ultimatum pentru Zelenski. Occidentul îl ajută până în toamnă, după care trebuie să negocieze pacea. De ce nu discutăm mâine? Toți soldații ca carne de tun până în toamnă ca să mai jucăm o fisă?
Știu ce te interesează.
Bogații lumii poluează pentru că își permit să plătească răul pe care îl fac, o spune Bill Gates.
Este un handicapat.
Cred cu siguranță.
Știu cum să te fac curios.
Război în masă. Veganii și vegetarianii și-au făcut aplicația lor de dating. Până la urmă, e mult mai comod o astfel de relație.
Știu cum să te emoționezi.
Întâlnirile cu prietenii și familia sunt motivul pentru care zâmbim în fiecare zi.
Dar nu trebuie să-ți legi fericirea de exterior.
Știu să conving.
Vă dau jucării noi, le promite Putin soldaților de pe front, arme nucleare.
Cât de nebun să fii să te gândești că te-ar ataca NATO, dar intra în Sankt Petersburg să facă ce cu el.
Gândește că și alții sunt nebuni ca el.
Știu să câștig.
De ce te super, Nemo? Am aliați mai buni.
Hai, Nemo.
Știu, deci știi.